In this lesson, we're going to learn how to modify our particle color as well as how to render out our ice particles using a volume material. So here's where we left off from the last lesson. I've just opened up lesson_80_start. So sometimes when you open up a scene file, the ice tree is going to load up empty. So just to bring it back, select your point cloud and hit the refresh icon to reload your ice tree. Now we currently have a base color on our particles, and that color is going to be eventually reflected in our render. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to set the particle color based on its age. So let's again find those nodes. So again, let's jump over to the Task tab, go down to our particle modifiers, and let's grab a modify particle color. And let's just drop this in. And you'll notice we're out of execute ports on our simulation root. However, we have this empty port that says new execute. And you can see it has a gray outline, but it has an empty interior. If we plug an execute port into this new execute, it will create a new port in that area and then move down. So that's how we can add new execute ports into something like the simulation root, or you can also see this on the ice tree. Alright, so now let's open up our modify particle color, and it's going to be very similar to our modify particle size, but this time we have a gradient that shows us the particle color from 0 to its end value of 1. So if we rewind and hit play, we're going to see our particles change color from 0 to 1. However, again, since our particles are dying when they hit 0.3, or whatever our value is here, we're not going to be able to see the change. Now, let's plug our scalar value into our end value here, but it's actually going to change something in our properties window here. So let's take a look at this. You'll notice that we can edit the end value here. But as soon as we plug in this scalar value to drive this end value, it disappears from our properties panel. So that is why you might see your properties panel update, or why something that was there or is usually there disappears. If it's being driven by another ice node, it's not going to be shown inside of the properties panel because we would need to go to a different node to modify it. But now that we've got the end value plugged in correctly, let's rewind and hit play, and we should be able to see our gradient from 0 to 1. Okay, great. So as you can see here, when they're born, they start with this blue color, and then they die at this green color. So let's now modify this to create a smoke-like effect. So let's select this first left part of the gradient, and I'm just going to give this a white color by left-clicking on the color swatch and dragging it down to one of the corners. Now for the right hand, I'd like to have a brown color, but I'd also like it to be transparent. So let's select this, and let's begin by jumping over, and let's give it this sort of a red or a darker brown color. And we can create this or make this transparent by changing its alpha value, or this A. So let's set the A all the way down to 0. And now if we rewind and play, we should see our particles start out white and then begin to become more and more transparent as they age. Now I'd like it to be a little bit gray and fully opaque, or no transparency, about a third of a way into its lifespan. So let's actually add a new color swatch to our gradient here. Let's just left click and drag. You can see we now have a new color we can plug things into. So let's change this color to just a slightly darker white color. And we can drag this down a little bit further. So now as our particles are born and they age, they're going to change colors from white to gray to a transparent brown. However, we're not going to be able to see this reflected in the render until we add a material. Let's bring up our render region with the Q key and take a look at what this looks like initially. So if we hold down Q and draw out our render region, I'm just going to give Softimage a second to render this out. And we can see instead of our wonderful particles appearing, we have these boring gray spheres. And that's because by default, every particle cloud is created with the default scene material. So let's now select our particle cloud and let's give it a new material. So let's drop down our render menu, go down to Get Material, and let's get an ice particle volume. Now this is going to create a shading network. So let's jump over to our render view here. So I'm going to come down to our render tree so we can see exactly what it just created for us. And now we have access to quite a few new properties. Now we're not going to be going into all of these properties, but just to check that this works, let's now draw this again to see what our updated preview looks like. And now we can see the particle color is correctly applied inside of our scene, and we're starting to get a smoke-like effect. However, as you can see here, we have a pretty thin cloud going from our hose. And this usually happens when we apply a volume shader, because instead of rendering the outside of the spheres, it's now sort of applying a texture inside of it with a little bit of fall off. So we only get a result in the most dense areas of our cloud here, or of our particle cloud. So I'd actually like to increase this, or increase the density of this. And the easiest way that I've found to do this is actually just to emit more particles. So let's go back to our ice tree, and I'm just going to hit Alt-9 to bring this up. Let's go back to our emitter up here where we keyed the rate. And let's just jump back to the last keyframe using this animation jump to the keyframe we set on frame 60. Now instead of a rate of 200, let's actually bump this up by an order of 10 to up to 2000. And click again. Now, this may seem like a lot with the initial rate only being 100, but because we're killing these particles so quickly, we're going to need a higher emission rate to counteract that. So let's rewind and hit play, and let's just stop it again on roughly the same frame, and we can see we now have many more particles inside of our scene. So let's take a look at how this is rendering. So again, I'm just going to hold Q and draw out my render region. And now we can see a much more, or a much denser cloud being generated. Now, let's take a look again at our render tree, because we have quite a lot of settings here. So we've created a new material, and it's also automatically created a particle renderer and then a particle shaper plugged into our density. Now, a lot of the rendering comes from our particle shaper, because that is what's controlling this density attribute, or how intense or dense our cloud looks. And this is actually created by default at a different scale. And so depending on the size of our scene, we're going to need to come in and change a few attributes. So let's open up our particle shaper here. And just to give us a nice preset, let's go over to presets, and let's just change this into billowing. And that is going to change each of these attributes to give us a more cloud-like effect. So great for this smoke, for this very dense cloud-like effect. Once that's done, let's go over to our cell shape and our fractal shape, and let's reduce our texture scale. Again, based on the size of your scene and the size of our particles, this is going to be different. In our case, we need to reduce this quite drastically. And I'm actually going to reduce this down to around 1.5, around 2. And I came about this value by just experimenting with this, taking a look at other scenes in the scale of those particles, and then modifying this scale to match our relatively small particles. Now we're going to see a slight change, a little bit more detail appearing inside of our scene, but we also need to update one more value inside of our fractal shape. Let's reduce this texture scale down to 5. And again, this value was the result of playing around with these values a little bit and trying to get something that matches our particles. Now, this is going to come out a little bit plain until we get some more shadows and some more lighting in here. But we're not going to be able to get into that until we jump into the lighting and rendering section in the next few lessons. So for now, this is going to be about as good as we can get before we begin getting into lighting and rendering, which is really outside of the scope of these ice dynamics. One last thing we can change to make the smoke a little bit softer is we can jump into our particle renderer and we can reduce our global volume density down a little bit. And that's going to make all of these particles a little bit more transparent. And since we increase the rate of these particles so much, I like to bring down the global density a little bit to make them more transparent. And this is a great way to control the overall transparency or the opacity of the entire point cloud. So you can see as we reduce this, we're making it a little bit softer. Now there's two more things we need to adjust that we're not really going to see the result of a change, but we'll talk about them so we can see the result once we get to the lighting and the rendering. So I want to bump up the shadow adjust to 1.5, and this is essentially saying how much should the shadows affect our particle renderer. And because shadows play a great deal in defining volume, I'd like the shadows to be a much stronger component of this render. Now again, we're not going to see a change because we do not yet have shadows enabled on our lights. Finally, let's go over to volume rendering, and let's just decrease our shadow table cell size. Again, this is a little bit more of a complex topic, but the shadow table, again, defines how much should the shadows be rendered, and a smaller cell size will result in a higher quality final render. Okay, so these particles are looking good. Again, they're going to really come out and shine once we get some lights and we adjust our render settings to create the appropriate environment for our particles to live in. But for now, we're essentially done with our ice dynamics section. So in this lesson, we took a look at how we could create a new ice node to modify our particle color based off of time, and how we can use the ice particle volume material to then drive or have our renderer use our particle color in the final render. So in the next lesson, I'm going to hand this over to Kyle to begin talking about the lighting and the rendering features of Softimage.